just going to say, simply by way of quick background, that I did my PhD on Chopin in his early music and the relationship to improvisation.
Oh, splendid.
So it was a huge body of Schenkerian analyses to show how tonal structure evolved, and then related that to Schenker's notion of improvisation. So this is a topic generally that absolutely fascinates me, but it does lead to a number of very important questions, which might begin with, how does one reconstruct a lost art? Because to some extent, improvisation in the classical sphere has died out, say, from about 1840 or 50. That's not, strictly speaking, true, but in terms of what it used to be, it's no longer what it was, put it that way. So how do you go about trying to reconstruct what might be described as this lost art?
Well, of course, one has to consider the fact that the art survived for quite a long time. In avatars like Chopin and Liszt in particular kept this tradition going, and it was natural that as the musical language evolved, that the content of improvisation would move along with it, except for the fact that improvisation became later a more or less standalone kind of thing, whether French organists were doing it or whether Liszt was doing it, or Chopin, who allegedly first created his ballades through improvisation and then fixed them in a more permanent and sublime way. But the interesting thing about the 18th century is that the improvisation is woven through standard concert activity, from the most serviceable continual player supplying harmonic support to cadenzas and concertos and decoration, both with an instrumental solo and chamber works and orchestra works. So there you're working against a background of a stylistic body of knowledge which is as available now as it was then. And it becomes, I mean, after all, we study Latin, although people don't speak it anymore. One studies the classical language and sees its characteristic turns of phrases. One notices the precise way that a Haydn and a Mozart use a common language in different ways, that the scope of the harmonic vocabulary is different, for instance. Beethoven's harmonic vocabulary, for instance, is much more restricted than, say, Mozart's is, not through a lack of ability, but through a definite intention. And so the more one is aware of the idiosyncrasies of a particular composer, the more one is able to absorb them and turn them into something fluid and to be sure, dangerous, but based, one hopes, on the details of the language. It means obviously that as you try to do it, you start to sort things out and you begin to realize that you just played something that you won't find in a piece of Haydn, or you won't find in a piece of Beethoven, and you think about what about it is not characteristic of the style, and try to ban that detail to the extent that you can work in split-second timing and be on the proper side of the language. You know, it's a little like, I mean, look what happened when Vivien Leigh had to play Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. You know, a lot of Americans were scandalized that a British actress was brought over to play the quintessential Southern Belle. And of course, how hard she had to work to get that accent, because a good linguist, of course, will listen to anybody in the UK and, probably be able to take that accent and specify a 10 square mile area based on one vowel or a particular expression. And the same thing holds true with music.
I mean, but the challenges in the case of music are nevertheless pretty difficult when we're trying to capture the accent of Mozart. And I wonder whether you had any advice for the rest of us in terms of building the kind of knowledge that allows you to achieve that immersion, which is something that is very difficult to achieve. I mean, I suspect that when you're improvising and you are doing so in say, a way that you would consider to be in keeping with the spirit of Mozart, you're drawing on years and years and years of knowledge and background and experience and deep consideration, which doesn't just happen overnight.
No, that's quite so.
Yes.
And one could say that the act of improvisation is a little bit like a PhD candidate taking general's exams. You know, it is an examination, because in that art of the mercurial, you are putting all of your knowledge and experience to an instantaneous test. And in order to prepare for that examination, you have to do a great deal of study, unless you happen to be a person like Mozart, whose genius will allow him to short-circuit all of those things. But for the rest of us mere mortals, it comes from very, very careful, acute observation. I mean, you know, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. I mean, it's what you don't notice which will, in fact, undermine what you seek to do. And everything that you do notice, you know, when I first got involved in this, I was a conducting student of Hans Swarovski, and I talked to him about Mozart concertos, and he said anyone who played Mozart concertos had to improvise. And I found this in 1966 very shocking, because I didn't know anybody who played Mozart concertos at that time who was improvising. I mean, the great Mozart interpreters of the 1960s, you know, Rudolf Serkin and Alfred Brendel and so on. I mean, these people played Mozart absolutely wonderfully, Kasatsu, but there was no trace of improvisation in any of that. And he referred to a disc he had made with Friedrich Gulde, who of course played jazz as well as classical music, and said, get that recording, listen to it, and imitate it. And I was thunderstruck by the audacity of what Gulde was doing, and thinking how to make this work. And by what seems sheer coincidence, a fellow classmate came along and said, I'm doing a version of I'm going to conduct the Mozart Requiem at St. Paul's Church here in Cambridge. How would you like to play the organ part? And I thought, gosh, what a fantastic privilege to be able to play the organ part of Mozart Requiem. He says, and I know that you're fascinated by Mozart, and this new edition that's just come out of Bärenreiter has in the appendix an Amen fugue, which Mozart evidently intended to use to conclude the Lacrimosa, but Süssmayr, who was daunted by fugal writing, simply had two chords Amen in the typical fashion. Why don't you finish that fugue, and we'll perform it as part of what we do? And I thought he was mad, you know. I thought you can make a complete fool of yourself much more easily in other ways. And yet, on the other hand, I thought, here's Swarovski telling me that I've got to improvise in the style of Mozart, which is like running to walking. And if you want to be able to improvise Mozart, you probably need to compose him first. So maybe this idea, which is doomed to failure, could be helpful. Right. And so I did finish the fugue, and we did perform it, and I then became rather curious as to whether Mozart had left any other unfinished works, because obviously the Requiem, he died, so that could be a one-off. Yes. But I found out to my amazement that no great composer in the history of music of that stature had left a larger number of substantial musical torsos as Mozart. There are over 140 of them. Right. And at that time I decided to transfer from the French department to the music department and write a senior thesis on the unfinished works of Mozart rather than on the poetry of Charles Baudelaire. And then I got very interested in these things, and I chose three representative genres: concerto, chamber music, church music. I already had my little Amen fugue done, and I chose the B-flat clarinet quintet fragment, not the famous A major, but a different one from 1791, and the concerto movement for piano and violin and orchestra that he wrote in Mannheim. And in each case, I went to Europe, found the manuscript, looked at it, re-edited it, and provided it with a performance-capable completion. And at that time, I was 20 years old. So what did I know? What I knew was something inchoate that I had gathered from listening dozens of times to music that I loved. But I really didn't know what I was doing, except that I was trying intuitively to grasp that sort of thing. And over the years, of course, as I learned more and more, it became less a question of dumb luck and more a question of really trying to get into his mind. And one of my lectures here in Cambridge is precisely going to be about that. When you talk about improvising Mozart, of course, there it's a split-second thing, and you're dependent upon both inspiration and an avoidance of misfiring neurons. Whereas when you're sitting with a pencil, which you can cross things out or erase them, you really have the opportunity to say, now, what would he have done at this moment, and why would he have done it? And often a great way to put that to the test is to look at the manuscripts, and you can see places where he's crossed things out, where he's blotted them out, and you start to say, now, why did he do that? It would be, of course, obvious to say, well, because it made it better. But it's not always true. For instance, many of the changes in the piano concerto solo parts are not made to improve the concerto, but to simplify it, because he just didn't have the time to practice the piece. He was going to be playing it that night, and, well, bloody hell, he was the composer. He could play anything he wanted, and no one had ever heard it before. So he takes really demanding sweat-inducing passages and reduces them to something much more idiomatic and sometimes more anodyne. So we now, 200 years later, have the time to practice that he didn't have, so we can afford to actually learn some of these difficult things and see what it teaches us. And one of the things I think it teaches us is that when he composes, despite the fact that he's a supreme string and keyboard player, that he will think abstractly, and what he puts down on the page might be a bit of a devil to play, notwithstanding his knowledge of what's playable and not. And that's really very interesting.
Yes. I mean, you're alluding to a kind of second sight that one develops over time, an intuition or instinct for the composer's language, which then can be realized under the fingers while improvising or in other contexts as well. But I wondered whether you felt one could go too far. I mean, there's an interesting and necessary balance to strike between fidelity on the one hand and one's own creativity. And I mean, I was thinking last night in your lecture when you referred to Mozart's cadenzas not modulating, they stayed within the realm of the tonic key. I mean, I wondered whether, for instance, you would countenance a modulation in a cadenza or indeed some other change of the musical idiom that in a way conflicted with the language of the composer, but nevertheless allowed you to exercise your own improvisatory creativity.
Well, I think the basis for a decision like that has to do with what ground rules one personally associates with it. In other words, after all, composers and performers in the 19th century continued to play Mozart concertos, and when they wrote cadenzas to those concertos, they didn't write them in Mozart style, they wrote them in their own. And so listening to Brahms's cadenza to K453 or his revision of Clara Schumann's cadenza to the D minor concerto, or Fauré's cadenza to the C minor Mozart, or Saint-Saëns for that matter, or again Clara's, are fascinating kinds of things, as are more modern cadenzas, like the cadenza to K482 that Benjamin Britten wrote for Sviatoslav Richter, which is an amazing stylistic amalgam of a bit of Shostakovich, a bit of Britten, a bit of this and that. I think everybody has to make a personal decision about that. I am, for myself, taking as a point of departure the sense of having the right costume and the right architecture and so on. If Sense and Sensibility is to be filmed, then you have to make some basic decisions about finding an appropriate geographical venue and deciding on costumes. And of course, Hollywood is obsessive about these things. Yes. If there's an action film that takes place in Al Capone's Chicago, they're going to make sure that the automobiles that you see in these scenes are from that period and not 5 years later. Now, things do get messed up sometimes. I'm told that in one of the Jane Austen filmings, there's an exterior, and if you look carefully, you see an airplane flying by, which of course is extremely amusing, and many people may not see it in their peripheral vision, but of course it does put the lie.
Perhaps it was an early prototype. But of course those films nevertheless do adapt the costumes, so they aren't actually costumes plucked off the shelves of some sort of archive somewhere.
No, not exactly, but they're
to modern taste. And that's actually an interesting question with respect to historical performance practices generally for our time, because of course I'm sure you'd agree that they could never really be absolutely identical to what the players of the day produced.
No, and Richard Taruskin wrote very tellingly about that, saying that the whole so-called authenticity movement said more about our age than it said about the one to which it strives. I understand that. He says it's the not just the zeitgeist, but the Zeitangst. That having lost this direct romantic tradition, people are more or less desperately looking for a certain kind of legitimacy. That's not at all what characterizes what I do. I grew up playing Mozart concertos on the Steinway, and I still play Mozart concertos on the Steinway. Several days ago, I played the D minor in Moscow on the Steinway, and my wife and I have 3 Steinways at home. We are Steinway artists, and we're very proud of it, and I'm never going to stop playing those instruments because I think there's a lot to be said for it. But it does seem to me that any work of art is a reflection and a creature of its own time. And so there's certain things about that time that it behooves us to know. Now, as to how far you can go outside of the known limit of Mozart, that has a lot to do with how much one personally knows about those limitations, or I would rather say parameters. I remember having a very intense conversation with perhaps one of the greatest Mozart connoisseurs of the 20th century, the composer and musicologist Marius Vlothaus from Amsterdam. And we were talking about a particular turn of phrase in a piece whose authenticity was subject to debate. Yes. And I said, see, this particular progression is something that Mozart never did. And Marius said, but he could have done it. Mm-hmm. I said, Marius, if you tell me that there's a piece that I had overlooked in which Mozart did it, that's the end of the argument. But when you tell me he could have done it, with what authority? I mean, I know you know more about Mozart's style than anybody in the world, but with what authority can you claim that, yes, he could have done this? Well, he also could have used the Tristan chord. Yes. At what point do you...
many other things.
Yeah, and this, of course, is the anguish that characterizes someone who wishes to work within the style of someone else, which is you're slipping on that person's clothes and you're trying to speak with that person's brogue, and it means that your paradigm is defined by everything that person left behind, which in Mozart's case is maybe 850 pieces complete and incomplete. Yes. But, of course, we will all acknowledge that virtually every piece, not everyone, but virtually every piece of Mozart is susceptible to having some particular detail that is not found in any other. Mm-hmm. Meaning, as you say, that in the next piece and the next piece he would have written in 1792 or 1795, there's the potential for all kinds of content for which we have no documentation. And yet, how do we recognize the voice of a composer if not through the sum total of the things that he said and by association with those things that he did not say? Yes. And if, in fact, you start allowing yourself to do all of these things on the speculative impulse that, maybe later he could have done that, finally no one can really decide whether it sounds like Mozart or whether it doesn't sound like Mozart. So for me, the challenge is to improvise Beethoven cadenzas and Mozart cadenzas and Haydn cadenzas, and to improvise in the style of Mendelssohn or in Liszt or in Schubert in ways which do not show any obvious stylistic deviance from everything that we know. Now, it's obviously true that in an improvisation you are creating a succession of tones which does not exist in any piece by Mozart. When I was asked to improvise a fantasy here in Cambridge, and I was presented with these three tunes, I made them do things which do not happen in those pieces. Yes. But it seems to me that although even the strategy may differ quite wildly from what is to be found in those pieces, yet there is a certain kind of architectural or rhetorical impulse which can be recognized by people who know the style as being characteristic, idiomatic, or at least, if not characteristic and idiomatic, shall we say, reconcilable with his approach to these things.
I mean, I think what you're suggesting is that in a way there can be a dialogue with the past. It is not a matter, on the one hand, of taking it over,
no.
On the other hand, of being subservient to it. And
that's
so
right.
Your improvisation here in Cambridge reflected and drew upon models from the past, but didn't, on the one hand, claim to be something that would have happened in 1785. Nor was it purely Robert Levin. And that kind of balance is a very interesting and enriching one, I think.
Well, it's a restless one, of course, and I think
profitably restless.
Yes, I think the most important thing about improvisation is that it seems to me that it's more or less 2 minutes to 12 for classical music in the wide world, and we have become a much more, reproducers of music, and we shoot it with formaldehyde. I mean, we are really more preservers of something than those who keep it alive. And one of the primary reasons for that is that the element of risk has all but disappeared in performance. Yes. And the most important thing about improvisation is that it's risky, that there is absolutely the possibility that you're going to fall on your face. Yes. And when I'm playing a concerto by Mozart and we get to the 6/4 chord, you can feel the tension in the audience because they realize that you're going to shoot the crossbow from one precipice to the other side, and you're going to walk the tightrope, and maybe it'll work or not. And when you get to the trill and the orchestra comes in, you can hear people exhale. Yes. And this already, I think, is an important thing that would justify improvisation if there were no other factors. But when people ask me what the main benefit I feel as a performer to doing this, that's not what it is. What it is turns out to be the fact that when you have trained yourself to contemplate an object, which can be a tune or a progression or any sort of detail that will animate an improvisation, you begin to see possibilities. And as you play the rest of the piece, which is 98% of it, at every turn, at this phrase, at that, you become aware of options that the composer had that he could have done, which either at the last minute, jerking the steering wheel around, or jamming on the brake, suddenly he turns in another direction. Yes. And as a result of that, the performance of the entire piece acquires a volatility that it would not have if one were not thinking in that kind of way.
Yes, I mean, this is something I'm continually saying to my students, is play the piece as if you were improvising it or composing it for the first time.
Well, indeed.
Because if you play it as if it's given, it's not going to have that life. And I think it may not be always a matter of risk, but it is always a matter of discovery.
Absolutely.
And new creation, and that kind of dynamic, I think, is often lost, not only on the part of students, but many more mature performers as well.
Well, very well. And one goes to performances that one could admire, but they're not life transforming because they're accomplished readings. And particularly in competitions, you see young artists who have toiled for hundreds and thousands of hours in the practice room, polishing everything to a fare thee well. And the Germans have a saying about this. They say, nothing happens, but nothing happens. So I mean, you can actually translate that in one of two ways. You can say, nothing good happens, but nothing bad happens. Well, nothing bad happens, but nothing good happens. And this kind of embalming that supposedly does honor to the glories of the past really does render it completely lacking in ability to shatter us. And we go to the cinema to be shattered, and is it possible that Chopin's music is less shattering than Mission Impossible 3? I don't accept it. Yes. I don't accept it, but I think if we're going to make this happen, we have to see the revolutionary qualities in Chopin's music. Yes, we see the nobility. Yes, we see the eloquence. We see the extraordinary transformation of what a keyboard can do. I mean, this man single-handedly changes the agenda for writing for the keyboard. Schumann is interested in it, but there's nobody like Chopin. And of course, the Russians never get over it. Scriabin can't, Rachmaninoff can't. I mean, it's all just Chopin with an update.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've referred in your comments to the improvisation of cadenzas in Mozart's concertos, and there must have been a first time when you did it, and first times, if you like, with respect to performance and recording and so forth. What were you trying to do? I mean, was this something that was bold and different, and what were your goals? And
well, I really thought at the time I did it, it was coming out of what Swarovski had told me as a conducting teacher, that Mozart required improvisation and decoration and busking along with the tutis, and doing all of these things, which seemed to me rather radical. And apart from Gulda, I couldn't go and study with him in Vienna at that time. Vietnam War, I would have sent me right to the jungles with a rifle in my hands. And by the time I could have, he was no longer on the scene. So I had to teach myself how to do this. My training with Nadia Boulanger was an immense toolbox, which prepared me for all sorts of things. And the keyboard harmony that she relentlessly imparted to me, of course, gave me precisely the kind of carbohydrates, the starch that I needed to take an advanced knowledge of voice leading and parlay it with the stylistic overlay of Mozart into doing this. And so I started to perform Mozart and Beethoven concertos with improvisations. And it happened over quite a long period of time. And the turning point came in 1989 when in Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was a conference on the Mozart piano concertos with papers being read and performances on period instruments. And Roger Norrington was there as the conductor for those who wished to have a conductor. Some did not. Yes. And we had the piano in all imaginable positions and so on. Malcolm Bilson was there, Kurt Selheim was there, Seth and Maurice Carlin were there, Leslie Tung was there, Stephen Lubin was there. There were 11 pianists playing 10 concertos because there was a performance of the double. Mm-hmm. And I was the last person, and I was doing the C minor concerto in the final concert with improvised cadenzas. And it had an electrifying effect on the audience there. This was an audience of experts. Alan Tyson was there, Stanley Sadie was there. Right. You know, all these people were there, and this was happening, and it had not happened before. And the next day, Eva Badura-Skota in the wrap-up got up and said that, you know, it was very interesting that this happened, but it showed that you really can't do this because there's always the risk that something could go wrong and then it would spoil everything. Yes. And there were huge boos from everybody, and people got up and said, for heaven's sake, this is the most exciting thing that we've ever experienced. I mean, this person on thin ice doing this, and the urgency of expression, my God, if there's a little bit of blood on the tracks, it's a price that's well worth paying, you see. And Roger and I collaborated on that performance, and only a couple of years later, I was in Freiburg, and Jeremy Marr called me from Channel 4 and said he was doing a broadcast series on improvisation in world cultures, and he was doing very well everywhere in the world except with Western classical music, where all he had was French organists. Right. And was there anything else? Some people had told him that I might be a person to call. And I said, yes, well, I do these improvisations. He said, well, how could we do that in a television show? I said, get together a band, and we'll play maybe 2 or 3 minutes leading into the cadenza spot, and I'll improvise a cadenza. And then you can just start a couple of bars before, and I'll do another one, and I'll do another one. And people will be able to hear the volatility and the difference. He said, oh, I think I could do that. He said, so could you come to London to do that? I said, yes. He said, well, what band should we get? I said, get the Academy of Ancient Music and Christopher Hogwood. Right. So I actually met Chris Hogwood by causing him to be hired and not the other way around. Okay. But Chris at that point was running not only the AAM, but the Handel and Haydn Society in Boston. And he enjoyed our collaboration. You can still see my conversation with Jeremy Marr on YouTube with a much younger me and a much younger Chris Hogwood, participating in this discussion. And we did a couple of concerts. And at that point, Decca was rather interested in Mozart concertos. And Chris said, well, let's do a couple. And Decca said, no, let's do the lot. And so we started in 1993 with K271 and K414. That was the first disc. And of course, Malcolm Bilson had been the pathbreaker who had done the complete cycle for Deutsche Grammophon Archiv with Sir John Eliot Gardner. And I was involved in that series, playing the double and the triple concerto. But of course, he was playing Mozart's cadenzas, and where there were none, he was composing them. And Jos van Immerzijl came out with a cycle and so on. But nobody was doing this rather radical thing that I was doing. And that was one of the ways that we sold the idea to Decca, that this was going to be a different kind of thing. And I dreamed up the idea of recording all of the Mozart cadenzas as well as multiple improvised cadenzas, saying that perhaps by the time we finished the cycle and put it out in a box, that the technology would have progressed to the point where either you could randomly generate the choice of cadenza, or you could choose one, and it would, instantaneously flip, which which couldn't happen in 1993 because you'd still have a gap and it wasn't quite right. But we have all of those things in the can, and they're there. But Decca, of course, canceled the series after 8 of the 13 discs, and I still have a fond hope of finishing with Chris this cycle. But when I started to do this, I wasn't trying to prove anything. What I was trying to do was to communicate the adventure, the energy, in some ways to reproduce the feeling that Mozart must have had riding the crest of a wave in Vienna in the 1780s, when, here he was, this composer, yes, but he was the greatest pianist in Europe. And that was more important to people. And he was this astonishing improviser, the proverbial Hollywood triple threat. And presenting these pieces as a vehicle for him to do this creates this extraordinary excitement at being present at a moment in history.
Yes.
And that presence needs spontaneity, it needs risk, it needs freshness, and even a certain lack of respect for what you could say ostensibly is a great monument of the past.
Say monuments, yes.
You see, you want to erase all of that and just think, here comes this guy. To me, the analogy with swing jazz, in Harlem is a very, very useful one, because you had Duke Ellington and Count Basie and all of these amazing guys and like Mozart's orchestra, there were no rehearsals. The charts came down, the horns came up, the downbeat came, and there was all this improvisation going on within the arrangement. And that's exactly what Mozart did. It's a different vernacular. And so what I wanted to convey was the excitement of all of this. Of course, when you hear an improvised cadenza on a CD, every time you play the CD, it's going to be the same cadenza. Yes. But it's like a snapshot of something. You can buy also a video or a CD of a jazz musician improvising in a club, and you'll hear it over and over again, and you'll become very familiar with every move. But you still know that its gestation was one that was spontaneous, and that changes things, I think.
So as a final lesson, it's a matter of history being relived, not of monuments being erected.
Absolutely, and of course with a complete understanding of one's own personal fallibility. I made no pretense. I mean, some people say, Malcolm Bilson said to me, he said, the difference between you and me when we play these things is I'm trying to get back to the spirit of these times, and you're trying to be Mozart.
Yes.
And I said, well, isn't that interesting? Isn't that worth trying to do? I mean, we can't, of course, equal his genius, but we have 200 years of hindsight. There's a way of objectifying the fruits of his genius, and we can get inside his mind in ways that say, a Haydn couldn't. Haydn copied Mozart the way Mozart copied Haydn, but they couldn't help but be themselves. Yes. My teacher, Nadia Boulanger, quoted Paul Valéry in the interviews conducted with Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean, and she observed that Valéry had said, in the past one imitated mastery, now one seeks singularity. And Nadia Boulanger observes here, it is really, she says, a really cruel statement that Valéry makes, because one is not singular by choice. Beethoven didn't change the world of music because he wanted to. There was no way he could do anything else but what he did. And he did not do it by seeking to be different. He could not but be different. And I think that's the point that is lost on many creative artists of our age, who are simply trying to differentiate themselves from others with greater or lesser success. And it becomes a moral issue as well, I think.
Thank you very much.